What Bishop Winans is telling about Donnie McClurkin and the startling reality of their altercation will astound you. For decades, these two men have been in the vanguard of the faith movement. They were once best friends, gospel giants, and steadfast pillars in the church community. Millions have been inspired by their songs. Their legacy in the gospel world is cemented, and their sermons have changed lives. Here's the startling bit though. In the background of their prosperous jobs, a long-standing conflict has been subtly developing. In the end, it would destroy their friendship. Bishop Wynn and Donnie McClurkin seemed to be the ideal combination for years. Two religious men who respected each other in addition to sharing music. They openly praised one another's achievements, appeared together on stages, and preached alongside one another. However, there was tension beneath the surface that nobody could perceive. They seemed like the ideal couple, don't you think? However, I must say that it wasn't as easy as it appeared. It becomes intriguing at this point. When Bishop Wynn began to believe that McClurkin was acting inappropriately, their relationship started to fall apart. Known for his strong voice and fearless testimony, McClurkin was always a believer in listening to God's voice, even if it meant defying the church's long-standing conventions. However, Winans, who was usually very rigid about upholding order and discipline, had a different perspective. It was more than just artistic variances to Winans. It had to do with compliance, trust, and deference to the authority that he had so diligently established as a senior leader. During a private meeting, the tension peaked. You see, Winans thought that McClurkin's leadership was compromised by a decision that he disagreed with. It was more than a simple project dispute. This was personal. No, Wynn believed that McClurkin had disregarded the system they had both worked so hard to create and had breached the rules. This was more than just a question of taste. It was an issue of power. The most absurd aspect was that McClurkin refused to back down. He didn't say sorry. Rather, he remained steadfast in his conviction that he was merely listening to God's message, even if it meant opposing the leadership he had long been a part of. McClurkin thought Wynn's demands were overly strict and domineering. He felt that listening to God's guidance was more important in ministering than adhering to laws created by humans. More important than any standards Wynn had established were his knowledge of faith, his ministry, and his relationship with God. A philosophical disagreement rocked their friendship to its foundation. Each man's perspective on obedience and power is what distinguishes this story. For Winans, religious leadership was unambiguous. There were roles and boundaries, and everyone had to abide by them. He valued organization, self-control, and sticking to the plan. However, McClurkin, who has always been an individualist, had a different perspective. He felt that listening to God's voice, rather than merely following orders from others, was essential to becoming a faithful servant of God. Their struggle revolved around this tension between individuality and obedience. Also, a simple apology wasn't enough to resolve the issue. Their dispute over a single project wasn't the only issue. It was far more profound than that. McClurkin had a reputation for defying expectations. His conflicts with his own identity and sexual orientation. His attitude to service was influenced by these first-hand encounters. He was not afraid to discuss the difficult aspects of his life. He desired that unadulterated genuineness to be reflected in his ministry. However, Winans, who cherished tradition, discipline, and order, thought McClurkin was going too far. There was more than one ministry project at issue in this dispute. It has to do with their perceptions of their leadership positions within the gospel community. The public was unaware of what was actually happening behind closed doors as this tension grew. Both men had always been viewed as leaders who had it all together by their admirers and followers. They were respectful of one another. They collaborated. Additionally, they were on the same stage. However, this simmering rivalry was about to explode behind the scenes. You won't believe how much worse things became. Everything would change in a single minute. The consequences for the public. The distance between the two was no longer merely personal. It was hard to overlook the tension between them as church leaders and fans saw it. This is where it becomes even more startling though. They both ended up in an unexpected scenario rather than continuing to conceal the tension. Fans eagerly awaited the public event, a church conference, where both were set to speak, wondering if the unpleasant tension would be resolved. However, they were unaware of what was going to occur. Everyone was taken aback by what they saw that day, and there were more questions than answers. The conflict between Bishop Winans and Donnie McClurkin grew more intense as the event day drew near. and neither was prepared to compromise. Anticipation permeated the atmosphere. These two guys had long represented togetherness in the Christian community, two strong leaders who appeared to have an unbreakable bond. But now that everyone was watching them, it was impossible to ignore the rifts that were beginning to appear in their previously flawless friendship. Everyone was wondering if the conflict would be resolved, or if it would just fester in silence. The atmosphere was exciting on the day of the conference, with enthusiastic churchgoers and admirers anticipating the stirring message they knew was on the horizon. The two men were expected to talk, and it was assumed that the wisdom and experience they had accumulated over the years would be reflected in their words. The unquestionable tension that would permeate the air as soon as both men took the platform was something the audience was not prepared for. First up was Bishop Winans. As he discussed the value of structure and discipline in the church, he stood erect and exuded authority. He advocated for unity and deference to authority. There was a certain coldness in his tone, and his remarks were calculated as if he were addressing someone personally. There were others in the crowd who felt he was implying that McClurkin's rebellious nature was being addressed. His message was unambiguous. The church would collapse in chaos. McClurkin sat silently to the side, arms folded, his face blank while Winans spoke. His quiet was a powerful statement. You could see he wasn't totally in agreement with what was being stated, even though he didn't interrupt. Everyone was waiting for McClurkin to grab the mic next, but for a little minute, it appeared as though everything may proceed as planned. Given everything that had happened behind closed doors, they were certain he wouldn't hold back. There was an almost electric charge in the air when McClurkin eventually got up to speak. The audience became hushed as they awaited his words. Everyone was surprised by his first words. He did not begin with the customary pleasantries and greetings. Rather, he started talking about faith in a genuine, honest, and intimate way. He discussed his path, the challenges he had encountered, and the times he felt conflicted between his purpose and the demands of others. Here's the twist, though. The very issue that had been generating friction between him and Winans was addressed by McClurkin without holding back. He discussed the necessity of ministerial independence and a more intimate relationship with God free from strict regulations. He discussed how the church frequently erected barriers and walls that prevented people from encountering God's genuine grace. It was obvious that he wasn't only addressing the audience, since his remarks were difficult, even combative. He was talking specifically about Winans. The audience was in disbelief. While some were uneasy, others nodded in agreement. There was a noticeable change in the space. In a sense, McClurkin was putting himself in danger. He had no intention of expressing regret or softening his convictions. Authenticity and freedom were central to his ministry, and he was determined to preach that message no matter what. Bishop Winans, who was seated close by, initially appeared unconcerned, but his expression stiffened. His displeasure with McClurkin's audacity was evident. He wasn't concerned by the message per se. It was the public challenge to the building he had been working on for years. Although he remained silent at the time, it was clear that he was uncomfortable. The crowd sensed it. Everything would change with what came next. An uneasy hush fell after McClurkin's speech. Nobody could predict Winnie's reaction. There was a noticeable tension. Then, suddenly, Bishop Winans was on his feet. He approached the podium cautiously while maintaining eye contact with McClurkin. It appeared for a brief period that he may simply leave the platform or say something to defuse the situation. But everyone was taken aback by what he said next. When he spoke to the crowd in a composed yet forceful tone, his comments reverberated across the room as he stated, "We are at a crossroads. Every leader has to make decisions about their beliefs, values, and style of leadership at some point in their lives. Let me clarify one point though. Church leadership necessitates unity. We will fail if we are not united." He hesitated, looking from McClurkin to the crowd. "However, we must not allow our disagreements to drive us apart. Whatever it takes, we have to figure out how to resolve this." It was not the scathing retort that was anticipated. Winans seems to be posing a challenge instead. His disagreement with McClurkin wasn't the only one. He was assuring him that they could still find common ground and that there was still hope for reconciliation. However, the query persisted. Would McClurkin take up that task, or did their partnership come to an end? To everyone's surprise, McClurkin refused to give up. He glanced at Winans before continuing. He spoke in a calm but confident manner. His words were, "I hear you. The fact is that the church occasionally places too much emphasis on following the rules and not enough on the love and grace that ought to be at the core of everything. However, if we are scared to be honest, we cannot advance. His word was delivered without hesitation, despite a tiny tremor in his voice. The audience was quiet as they awaited the following action. Would they be able to get back together? Or was their once unbreakable bond about to break down? The story was about to take a startling turn, and the questions were flying, and they intensified just when you thought they couldn't get much more severe. Everyone would be shocked by what transpired next, which also laid the groundwork for the relationship's eventual breakdown. Rumors and whispers abound in the days that follow. Everyone was curious about what would happen next, since what had happened on that stage was nothing short of sensational. Two of the most well-known people in the gospel world, Bishop Winnie and Donnie McClurkin, had publicly challenged one another in a way that no one could have foreseen. Once a sign of solidarity and respect for one another, their relationship now seemed to be in jeopardy. Everyone had the same question in mind. Would their friendship hold up in the face of this public test? Or did this mark the start of the end? It became evident as the tension increased that neither man was prepared to compromise. The strain was growing, and their ministries were on the line. Wynn had meticulously maintained his position of power and influence while constructing his empire over the course of several years. His beliefs in structure, discipline, and order had helped him succeed in his career. McClurkin, however, was a leader of a different sort. Conformity didn't interest him. He desired to escape the limitations that frequently characterize conventional church leadership. Many people, particularly the younger generation, were responding favorably to his message of authenticity, love, and freedom. The two men's disagreement had evolved beyond issues of leadership and theology. It was intimate. Wynn had to respond to McClurkin's defiance because it was a clear challenge to his authority. He had established himself as the person who kept everything together and spoke with reason. McClurkin was now threatening to take everything down. The scenario was far more difficult behind the scenes. Mentors, co-workers, and friends of both men were attempting to settle the conflict, but it was failing. It felt like every effort to unite them failed. Wynn's supporters were rooting for him and pleading with him to stick to his guns. On the other hand, McClurkin's supporters were urging him to continue moving forward and to stick to the principles that had made him so successful. There was no room for compromise, no middle ground. The entire church community seems to have been split into two factions. They were all certain that their leader was correct. As usual, the media wasn't doing anything to help. They seized the chance to take advantage of the rift in order to increase their ratings. The public's ravenous appetite for drama seemed to be fueled by every fresh headline. Interviews were conducted, articles were produced, and the conflict gained widespread attention. The public's interest in the outcome increased as they were exposed to the tension more. Would they make amends, or would their conflict go out of hand? The gap only widened as the weeks went by and both guys expressed their opinions on social media. In a post, Bishop Wynn reaffirmed his dedication to upholding church discipline. He discussed the value of tradition and how leaders occasionally have to make tough choices for the benefit of society as a whole. His supporters praised him for his resolve and steadfastness, applauding his position. However, there were as many critical remarks as there were complimentary ones. People questioned his inflexibility, wondering if the true problem was his inability to adjust to new concepts. Conversely, McClurkin posted a sincere statement of his own. He discussed the pressure he felt to live up to expectations as well as his own personal issues. He discussed the need for a new type of leadership that is more empathetic and inclusive. His supporters, many of whom had appreciated him for being honest and vulnerable, came together to support him and encourage him to stick to his convictions. However, Wynn's followers were eager to condemn McClurkin, saying he was compromising the core beliefs of the religion. The people, divided between the two men, watched the drama unfold. Some viewed McClurkin as the much-needed breath of fresh air, while others saw Winnie as the voice of reason, the one who kept the church grounded. However, neither one was going to back down, and the gap between them appeared to deepen the more they dug in their heels. Then, just when it looked like things couldn't get any worse, something unexpected happened. The public learned of a private chat between the two men that had been secretly recorded. Wynn and McClurkin were candid in discussing their displeasure with one another during the conversation. McClurkin acknowledged that he had felt suppressed by Winans' leadership for years, while Wynn acknowledged that he felt deceived by McClurkin's behavior. Their voices were painfully honest, exposing the deep emotional scars that had been festering for years. The town was rocked when the recording was made public. It was one thing for the two men to quarrel in public, but it was quite another to have their innermost thoughts exposed. The deep, unsolved problems that had been brewing beneath the surface were finally visible to the general public. People began to question whether there was still hope for reconciliation or if this was the end for the two leaders. Both men fell silent for a moment. Their social media posts grew increasingly irregular, and they declined to interact with the media. The entire globe waited to see what would happen. Was this their relationship's last chapter? Or did they still have a chance to mend the harm and go on together? The pressure was mounting and the clock was running out. With everyone watching, it appeared like there was no escaping the inevitable outcome. However, as time went on, an odd thing started to occur. Though nobody could foresee what would happen, a spark of optimism appeared. The stillness between McClurkin and Wynn got louder over time. The media was still buzzing. Despite the public's ongoing speculation, neither guy appeared prepared to initiate contact. An unsettling silence had taken the place of the tension that had previously pervaded every room, stage, and moment. Both men appeared to be waiting for something, for the ideal opportunity, or maybe for the other to blink first. However, the silent revolution taking place in the background was something neither of them could have predicted. There were indications of a change as the days passed. The very individuals who had been so ardently in favor of the two men were starting to doubt the wisdom of their differences. Wynn's supporters, many of whom had viewed him as a staunch defender of tradition, began to question whether his resistance to change was ultimately preventing the church from progressing. Supporters of McClurkin, who had praised his progressive, inclusive style, started to experience the consequences of his disobedience to the status quo. The desire for reconciliation and the issue of unity started to take precedence over the desire for divide. The followers weren't the only ones beginning to shift. There were murmurs of worry even among colleagues, mentors, and other religious leaders behind closed doors. Some thought that a reconciliation between the two would not only mend their personal grievances, but also serve as a potent example for the church as a whole. Winans and McClurkin were not the only ones with the wounds that had caused them to separate ways. They stood in for the larger conflicts that exist within the religious community, conflicts between control and freedom, tradition and change. However, there were still some who insisted on the morality of their side, despite every call for reconciliation. The division had not ended yet, unless anything extraordinary occurred to jolt both men out of their quiet. It appeared as though this feud may go on forever. When an unexpected source came forward, the breakthrough was made. An older member of the church who had known both guys for many years. This revered senior, who had no personal interest, contacted Winans and McClurkin separately and offered them the chance to meet in secret, away from prying eyes and the demands of their supporters. In his speech, he discussed their common past, the lives they had impacted together, and the efforts they had made to shape the faith community into what it is now. Forgetting the past wasn't the point. It was about understanding that something bigger might still be built on the foundation of their past. He asked them to consider the others who relied on their guidance and the example they presented. Both men initially objected. Their egos were hurt, their pride crushed. However, the prospect of sitting down in person grew more alluring as the days went by. Maybe they were sick of fighting all the time. Maybe they wished for tranquility. Maybe they realized in their hearts that they couldn't go forward apart. The meeting was discreetly organized, and tensions ran high on the day of the event. Neither Wynn nor McClurkin knew exactly what to anticipate when they walked into the room. Naturally, the older was present, but after months of fighting, it was just the two of them facing one another. There was a dense quiet. At first, nobody said anything. They appeared to be waiting for the other to initiate contact. Then the silence was abruptly broken by McClurkin. He was the first to speak, and his tone was composed yet passionate. He expressed regret for the events that had transpired. He accepted that his desire to promote change had motivated his actions, but he also stated that in his quest for advancement, he had neglected to respect the bond they had developed over the years. It wasn't about establishing who was correct or incorrect. It was about appreciating and comprehending one another's path. Wynn's face was difficult to read as he listened quietly. He had been on the defensive for so long, defending his vision and legacy. However, McClurkin's heart started to change as he went on. He acknowledged that perhaps he had been overly strict and preoccupied with keeping things under control. He had always believed that he was the one responsible for keeping everything together. But now, in the silence of the room, he questioned whether McClurkin's idea of freedom and his tradition could coexist. His voice was softer than anyone had heard in months when Winans spoke. Although he acknowledged that he had felt deceived, he also realized that change was unavoidable. Even though he didn't know everything, he was open to learning, growing, and listening. Both men understood then that their disagreement had nothing to do with their ministries or even the church. They were the focus, along with their pride and fear of misunderstanding. Hours passed as the two guys worked out their issues and rediscovered their mutual respect. Of course, there were tense moments, but there were also times when everyone laughed and understood each other. Brick by brick, the barriers they had erected between one another started to fall apart. It became evident at the conclusion of the conference that this was not the end, but rather the start of something new. To mend the wounds that had ripped them apart, they decided to cooperate. The real healing had already started in that quiet room, but the public would soon know that the split had been repaired. There was still uncertainty in the road ahead. They were aware that everyone would be observing them to determine whether their reconciliation was sincere or only a show for the public. But it didn't matter at the time. The fact that they had started the process of restoring what had been lost was what counted: mutual understanding, trust, and a common goal. Both guys felt at peace as they walked out of that meeting, something they hadn't experienced in months. The route ahead appeared clearer now that the storm had passed, even though the scars would still be there. Although they still had a long way to go, they were no longer traveling alone. They would confront whatever was ahead together, side by side this time.